So where I wanted to start was your interest in computing, and maybe let's just go back to roots and just talk about growing up. And
Well, my interest in computing derives from an interest in media, and the interest in media derives basically from the political environment in which I grew up. My parents were activists, and I was expected to be an activist. And that meant, in those days, mimeograph. When I was in 6th grade, I learned to run a mimeograph machine and other kinds of reproduction devices. I was a dutiful son and would go picket Woolworths in support of the Southern civil rights sit-ins and so forth, without really that much of a political understanding. I was supposed to be a trooper. I was supposed to do the work, carry the signs, run the mimeograph, and whatever is necessary. Naturally, I wound up coming to Berkeley in the early 60s, and didn't hang out with engineers. Hung out with, as much as I hung out with anyone, with political people, and picketed Madame New in 1963 when she appeared in San Francisco. Again, filling my part as a support person. The interest in computers, actually, my brother, older than I, 3 years older, he became interested in computers, started a computer club in high school when I was also in high school, drafted me as chief engineer, brought home books from the library with crude schematic diagrams without enough information in them for how to build latch circuits and flip-flops and so forth, and said, "Can you build this?" Well, our relationship was such that I really couldn't say no, and so I attempted to build them. We were in bad need of a real engineer to advise us, but we didn't have one or didn't seek one out. And so when you're trying to create a pulse, a clean-edge pulse by taking a wire and flicking it against a metal clip, you are doing, in effect, the best you can do to create a random signal. I didn't understand that till many years later, so our flip-flops worked about half the time.
what generation of computing was it in the outside world when you were in high school and doing this?
Well, it was still the vacuum tube era. Those were vacuum tube circuits, but of course those books dated from the 1940s. And that was it would have been 1959.
So even before the 360, this is early IBM era
Early
mainframe computing.
That's correct. It's definitely mainframe. Well, I left that with a bad taste in my mouth, and I figured computers are simply too delicate, finicky. They pay attention to every little bit. I wasn't interested in that. I was going to pursue a career as an electrical engineer, and that, from the root standpoint, derives from my grandfather on my mother's side, who invented the diesel injector. Died in 1920, and the family lost the money in the Depression. But I was never allowed to keep him out of my mind, and so I was going to be an inventor and have patents. And if it meant becoming an engineer, then I would become an engineer. So I was sent off to school with that sort of dual heritage. And I tried to combine them because I always saw myself as an engineer, as a technician, as a support person, as someone who was going to bring the benefits of whatever technology I had at my disposal to whatever project I was involved in with my heart and soul. Berkeley in 1963 and 64 was, as you can tell by looking at the film Berkeley in the 60s, a very interesting place indeed. And I found myself involved in the free speech movement in 1964. That was several months long. Somehow, and this is another story which I won't go into right now, I found myself working as a co-op work-study student, so that for that amazing semester I had no classes. I was working at a job on campus, so I had plenty of available time, and I even had an electronics shop available to me. Well, I tried to hang around all these very intelligent people, very politically savvy people, and find out what it was they wanted me to do. And then I would do it. That was the model I was pursuing. There came a moment, sometime, must have been November '64, I'm not sure which month, doesn't matter. I was hanging around the headquarters, the office, FSM Central, we called it. And it was night, and somebody came running in with or as it turns out, erroneous report that the campus was surrounded by police. The Berkeley campus is a big place, it would be hard to do that. Everybody went into a frenzy, and from my perspective, and this is strictly subjective, I saw everyone turn to me and say in unison, "Quick, make us a police radio." Well, I tried to explain to them, I knew they meant that in 1939 you could have detuned an AM radio up to 2 megahertz and work there, but now it was 30 to 50 megahertz narrowband FM. I said, "You don't understand. You can't do that quickly." To which the response of the entire room in unison was, "Never mind about that. Make us a police radio." So I finally had the event happen, but of course it made no sense. Yes, I could start a project that would lead towards a police radio, but of course they needed one that instant. And I realized at that moment that I was not to be a follower. It wouldn't work. I would always be late. I had to accept my responsibility if I wanted to work in a support fashion and make things happen that I wanted to have happen. I had to get out front with technology, and I had to have things on the shelf so that when people came running to me saying, "Quick, we need this or that," I would be able to say, "Well, you can't have that, but here's what you can have." So the dynamics, I realized that the political dynamics were such that, in effect, technological development came first. It came out of thin air. Then what followed from that was the commercial and the political use of the technology.
And was during that period, '64 to '68, was there computing stuff happening already?
Well, I wasn't aware of it. I mean, I didn't get back into computers until about 1970. I continued to follow the question of media and technology. In 1965, I was listening on the radio to reports coming in from the civil rights movement in the South. And I asked myself, what would it be like to design a nonviolent weapon? What would a nonviolent weapon be like? I didn't have the answer at that point, but I continued to sort of keep that as a low-level question, and I began to investigate media. I had a talent for writing, as it turns out. I took on the editorship of the Co-op House newsletter, and went on I tried to peddle myself as a columnist for the Daily Californian, was rejected, went down the street to the Berkeley Barb, was allowed to sit there and rewrite press releases. So I entered the underground press that way. Followed it through with everything I felt I could do, until I began to understand that the very structure of the medium was, in fact, the problem. I decided that there were broadcast media and non-broadcast media, and that print was a broadcast medium because all information was replicated and emitted from a central point. It was a choke point of information. The telephone system was my best example of non-broadcast media, as was person-to-person conversation, and then there's the postal system.
And you were thinking about these things sort of systematically in the late '60s?
Yes, I was. I began to put it all together sometime right about '69 or so. And I had an experience. In that time, I dropped out of the university short of graduation. It was a psychological depression. I really couldn't continue. Went to work, because I could do that while I'm depressed, as a junior engineer at Ampex Corporation. That would have been the end of '67 and the beginning January of '68.
Did you move to the Valley?
I did. I lived in a garage in Los Altos Hills until middle '69, when I moved to San Francisco and then to Berkeley.
So let's pick up in the Los Altos Hills again. You were living there, and there was all this stuff going on around you in the Stanford area. The resistance, the sort of the counterculture scene with the rock bands. And
Well, yes, I snooped around and I did some reporting for the Berkeley Barb as their correspondent from the peninsula on some of the sit-ins and demonstrations and so forth that were happening at that time.
Were you involved in the occupation of, God, this was the April 3rd movement? Were you around for the April 3rd movement?
I remember there was some sort of occupation. I was only peripherally. I mean, once a week or so I was able to come up and check in on things. I can't really say I was particularly active in this area.
And were you doing engineering at Ampex at the same time?
I was. In fact, I was designing products, as it turns out.
And how long did you stay down there? And
I stayed in Los Altos Hills from January '68 to about March of '69. And in that, I was evicted. The family wanted to move their son back into the garage, and so I decided to go head for San Francisco, where I might find what my heart desired, whatever that was. I was still in depression then, and the one thing you do is to move around.
And so, what brought you back to computing?
Well, in 1970, first of all, in 1969, I dropped out of Ampex to go work for the Barb. It was my last big effort trying to make the underground press work. And ran out of money by the end of the year. Called up and asked if I could get my job back, and I could. And in that case, the project was a computer-controlled audiovisual information retrieval system. It was big enough to fill a room in the basement. It was to be installed mostly in colleges, and it was a kind of a huge teaching machine. And it ran under control of a Data General Nova 1200 computer, mini computer. And so I was assigned to support the design of interface components. I was a hardware designer. But I was required to learn programming, so I was sent out to a service bureau. I don't know if they have those these days, but in those days, running mainframe computers, you went to a service bureau where they had terminals and they had young men in three-button suits who had a very lofty opinion of themselves teaching the details. So there I learned that, had my first experience, let's restart that. There I had my first experience with computer networks. The instructors would say, well, you hear where it sort of stuttered and is working more slowly. That's because the computer in Los Angeles has been turned off and we were shipped over to the computer in St. Louis or something. Wow, there's a big network with the computers on it somewhere. And you can communicate with any point with almost no negatives. And then it would show us that if you prefaced some message with a certain number of asterisks, the number of asterisks gave you a certain level of publicity. 3 asterisks and anyone using the system could have access to that message. 2 asterisks and it was some smaller set. 1 a yet smaller set. And I suppose no asterisks and only you could read the message. So I put those 2 pieces of information together and I realized here's a non-broadcast medium. You could use it to create, in effect, virtual communities. I didn't have the word at that time, but it's a better word than the one I had now. Communities of interest is what I thought of it as. And I said, this could be very useful from a political standpoint, from the standpoint of the formation of communities, which is always a very big thing for me. In the free speech movement, what really happened is that tens of thousands of individual alienated students formed a community through the events and the struggle. And that was possible because it was legitimate for people to talk laterally, that is to say, just to talk to each other, talk to a stranger about what's going on. So lateral channels of communication opened up there, and the result was amazing in terms of the explosion of possibilities. I wanted that all the time. So that's one thing that was motivating me.
Sorry, you didn't know about the stuff going on in Menlo Park around SRI. There was no sort of intersection at this point with...
Not at this point. The intersection, I came to that intersection around 1971. In 1970, I decided, okay, non-broadcast media will work on a computer network, well, which is a pretty, where am I going to get a computer, right? Computers filled rooms, they were mainframes. Networks, don't even think about it. Well, it happened that other people had thought about it. And in the Cambodia crisis of 1970, a group of computer science students left Berkeley, went to San Francisco, set up shop trying to somehow obtain access to computers, mostly time sharing, for use by community groups and whoever they thought was the right people to use them.
Do you remember any of their names?
Yes. It was Pam Hart, H-A-R-D-T, Chris Macy. Now, two more names are going to be hard for me to come up with, but those are the main two. I think Chris Newstrip was one of them, but I'm not sure. So they set up something called Computer Group 1. It was in Project 1, which was an attempt to create a community inside a warehouse. That was an architect's view of what you do. They had managed, mostly through the efforts of Pam, to secure the loan or long-term loan, or in effect donation, of a Scientific Data Systems SDS 940 time-sharing computer, which had been taken back by Transamerica Leasing. It had run at SRI. Apparently it was the one that ran Shaky the Robot. More on that later. So they were working on setting this thing up, and someone I knew who was a sort of crazy guy, you really didn't want to put up with him very long, but he always had information, came running up to me on the street one night in Berkeley and said, there's a group of people he knew about what I was trying to do. A group of people who've got this computer and they're trying to set it up, and they're in San Francisco, and here's where you can reach them. So I did, and I began working with them in 1971. And they, of course, had worked this out. I think Pam's father may have worked for Xerox. And they had a lot of contacts at Xerox PARC, at Stanford AI. So I began to make the contacts that way.
Okay. And at this point, I mean, were you sort of did you want a computer? Were you at all sort of caught up with the power of the computer? Or you were at this point already more interested in the power of a network than the power of a personal computer? Or do you think about
Correct.
it even that way?
Well, I began to think about what turned out to be personal computers through this effort. We had set up, we had written an information retrieval program. Rick Greenblatt came through town and said, let's write an information retrieval system in 48 hours or 24 hours. And that led eventually to a program running on this time-sharing computer, which was by then running in Project 1 in San Francisco, but didn't have any users. And we couldn't find our model that we would make our system available to the little card file and telephone sort of counterculture information bureaus that were springing up called switchboards. Didn't work because we were going to require them to rent a teletype to do it with. They didn't have any money, nor were they interested in forms of organization. Yeah. Well, so we had this computer with nothing in it, and we did, Ephraim Lipkin, whom I had brought in as a systems programmer, came up with the idea of putting a terminal out on the street in public and seeing what happened. And so we did that. It was called community memory. It's subject, there's a long discussion in that. But it worked fabulously. I mean, I could see the same kind of ferment and enthusiasm develop in that system as I had seen on the street in the free speech movement. So here was the door into what I call the commons of information, had opened. Well, what about the equipment? What do you need for that? We were using Model 33 teletypes that were off lease, in other words, been run through their commercial lifetime. So they kept breaking down and jamming. That was not good. That was not going to work. And video terminals were pretty expensive. They were $1,500. And it became clear from our experience with contract service that the service personnel didn't know what they were doing. So we had to think about what would be the terminal that would survive in a public environment. Now, at that time, my father, who had kind of gotten into the counterculture on his own back in the East Coast, sent me or referred me to a book by Ivan Illich, Tools for Conviviality, which had just been published. And it's a little essay, basically, that describes mostly the experience of radio in Central America. And he explained how 2 years after radio arrived, there were people, indigenous people present there, who knew how to fix it. Now, how did they get there? How did they get that knowledge? They didn't get it through the official channels. They got it because the radios would survive being experimented with. And that was how I learned about radio, which is where I started my electronics career as a kid. So that, to me, was manifestly true. Now I began to think, how can you make a terminal or a computer terminal that would survive being experimented with? And I came up with a little motto, which was, in order to survive in a public environment, a piece of computer equipment must create a computer club around itself.
Now, this was before Tom Swift?
This was Tom Swift.
This was
terminal.
Tom Swift, okay.
This was the genesis of the Tom Swift terminal. And so I began thinking about that, and I put out the notice on community memory, and Bob Marsh showed up and a few other people. And we had discussion groups about basically the engineering aspects of making a, start with a terminal, but whatever it had to be, it would be, so that it would create a computer club. It would have a group of enthusiasts that would create indigenously, locally.
So you weren't thinking about the homebrew computer club, but you were laying the roots. Or you were thinking about it, you just weren't thinking about it specifically.
I was coming at it, I had a problem. I was a good engineer. How can you solve a problem if you don't have one? So I had one. And I was approaching it with the experience that I gained from the environment. There's really nothing magic about that except the usual magic.
And take a break for a second and just talk about what life was like in the warehouse. I mean, this was the heart of countercultural San Francisco.
I called it the flagship of the counterculture. Well, I was there for 1 year. 1972, after I graduated, I returned to school at the end of 71, graduated in 6 months. Then I went off on doing what I felt should be done, which was to live in that warehouse, maintain the computer, even though I didn't necessarily know how. The person who was to train me had disappeared when the computer was installed, and I didn't really have the psychological strength to go admit I didn't know. But it was a 4-story plus basement, former candy factory from the 20s, concrete shell that a number of people had built these rather imaginative walls and so forth. They had all kinds of curved things and big doors that pivoted and so forth. It was a very, very imaginative place architecturally. And it was an attempt to create a community with a group of people and experimenting in, you could call it governance or the lack of governance, how much you needed to make a group of people go. And there was tension and so forth there. It's like any other human community. But we were trying to invent our own rules as we went.
And at the same time, in the outside, larger world, the war was really at its, I mean, this was,
Yes, Vietnam Veterans Against the War had their headquarters in that same building, and I helped them, at least with their CB radios, on the 1972 last patrol to the, whether it's GOP or Democratic, I can't remember, convention. And it was, there was the war on, and I had eventually, in 1970, had my encounter with the draft, which resulted in them saying, go home and wait. I'm waiting still. But that's part of the long story that I'm not telling.
Let's see, so you were talking about sort of the time. I wanted to jump back just a little bit and ask if you knew there was a really sort of seminal event called the 1968 Fall Joint Computer Conference in San Francisco where Engelbart gave this demo. Did you travel in those circles, or did you?
No, I did not travel in those circles. I was just a junior engineer. I was at school. I was studying general engineering. However, I began to hear about this. One of the things that happened when I was at Project One is I would go down to Menlo Park, take the train down on Wednesday nights for the potluck that was held at the People's Computer Center on Minalto Avenue. And that really was the center of the computer counterculture in the area. It was run by Bob Albrecht and
Dennis
others.
Allison was around.
Who?
Dennis Allison was
Dennis
around.
Allison, yes.
Dr. Dobbs, Dennis and Bob.
That's where it came from, yes. And there I began to hear about this legendary demo that had been done as another door into the future that was open if you wanted to go find it. I would go down to the potlucks at the People's Computer Center on Minalto Avenue in Menlo Park Wednesday nights. And there it was legitimate to assume that people ought to have computers, that there ought to be personal computers. It was seen as kind of self-evident, because there they were sitting in a place where there were at least, by that time, 2 mini computers there. Maybe just one, but at least it seemed like there were 2. PDP-8s and time sharing, and there were kids playing computer games. This was another sort of glimpse of the future, the important thing being that they were proving in practice, something that Bob Albrecht loved to prove whenever he could, that computers weren't for stuffed shirts alone, they weren't for academic users only, they did not imbue their users with any self-importance other than what the user claimed. So he would bring kids into trade shows to demonstrate the computer. Boy, that made him persona non grata on just about everybody's list. So he set up this storefront and brought kids in to use computers, published a newsletter, which is mainly aimed at educational people, but it was really an underground press kind of thing. So there it became legitimate to think about personal computers and what personal computers ought to be. It was there that I became encouraged enough to think that I could possibly even design a modem, which I wound up doing.
But you and this group of people were what I think of as outsiders.
Very much
and
so.
There was a very small group of insiders, but you were already sort of not only getting hardware sort of handed down, but you were getting the vision handed down.
Yes, we were. We were recycling visions and hardware, I think would be the way to put it.
Go back to the Tom Swift terminal. You were talking about
Well,
that.
Tom Swift Terminal was 1974.
Oh, it's later.
And this was 1973 was when I was doing the potluck. So this predated Tom Swift Terminal. But it was without that background, I would not have been thinking about the Tom Swift Terminal as such. Because I could think about the people and the milieu, and I could then place the technology into that milieu. Without the milieu, without the society in effect, I really wouldn't have what was necessary for the rest of that concept.
And at this point, did you still see yourself as an activist?
Yes.
There were demonstrations and...
Well, yes, there were still demonstrations against the war, which I would assist with as much as I could.
But you had moved out of the warehouse by this time.
By middle 1973, I'd moved out into an apartment in Berkeley that we had set up as a Berkeley office, so Ephraim didn't have to commute over to San Francisco.
And had community memory been created by this time?
It was created. It was opened up August 8th, 1973, I believe. That's within a week of the date. With the first terminal in Leopold's Records on Durant Street. And that's where we first saw that, again, the door to the commons of information open up.
And so you were sort of seeing what became the web, or I mean,
we were seeing elements that motivated the way that people interacted through computer networks. And really there was an impetus that we saw to have control of one's own information resources, one's own communication technology, and also I'm groping for the word here, but the way that it's used, the way the technology is used.
I want to go through that thought one more time.
Right, without the groping. We could see that there was a common thread that people wanted control over their own communication resources, be it technology, be it the way the technology is used. And that, I think, derives from the free speech movement in 1964. I've never seen a good explanation of that, and I don't think a single explanation is possible. I have, in fact, established the Free Speech Movement Archives as a nonprofit organization to try to pursue that issue of just what happened there and what came together and what did it result in. The free speech movement was predicated on the very radical concept that people don't really need institutions, and if they need institutions, they can make their own. And they don't need to be governed from above. It's really a very anarchistic kind of concept. And in that case, the revolt was against the University of California administration when it was really doing the bidding of its political masters and the sources of funding and so forth, when it came into conflict with the civil rights movement as it rebounded onto campus. But deep down, it really was an outbreak in a revolution of expectations, a revolution against centralized organization. So that propagated forward, and it's very interesting, I think, to look into that. I haven't done a lot of study of it, but I recommend that people do this. Because the people who came through Berkeley and other universities in the technological end, the grad students and so forth in computer science and so on, who went on to build the basis of the internet, I believe absorbed this understanding.
And was there, to jump back a little bit before I forget it, there was the Berkeley Computer Corporation.
There was.
Were there lines of interconnection, or was that a separate thread?
I never had any direct dealings with it. Ephraim and Jude were involved with it. And I think some of the people did get involved with the computer at Resource One in various ways.
So there's overlap.
So the technological development end, yes, comes from Project Genie at Berkeley, spun off the Berkeley Computer Corporation, which brought more people in to interact, and goes on from there. I was not really part of that.
Okay. And then, along with this notion of sort of individual control, I wanted to ask, this may have been a direction that the community memory went in, but at one point the community memory seemed to be anti-PC personal computer, if you will. Did it start that way?
Yes.
It did.
Yes, and this was because we intentionally decided not to put this online for access by people who were lucky enough and rich enough and fortunate enough, skilled enough to have terminals. This was the 70s and 80s. That's what you had to have. Because we did not want it to become a computer culture kind of thing. We knew that there were enough people around who would be on it chattering away about computers. We wanted it in laundromats and so forth, where we had it eventually, used by people who just needed, who liked to fish around in an information soup, which was congenial to them. So we decided specifically against a lot of pressure.
So it was really more than a PC vision, it was a web vision. You were just ahead of your time.
The PC was a necessary tool for the web. That's the way it happened in my experience. We had to think about, in order to have a network, a centerless network, and that was really important to us, which was impossible to be controlled. The level of activity had to be at the very lowest level, at a grassroots level, and that meant the Tom Swift terminals that would collect a computer club around them, because if you worked at them hard enough, you could grow them up into computers. And that's what the design of the Tom Swift terminal was. It was a bus system, and to make it a terminal, you didn't even need microprocessor, because they cost $350 in those days, if you didn't go talk turkey to Intel. So I designed something that would be central, where memory was the central point, and everything grew from there, and it could grow up, in theory, into a multi-computer array.
Okay. And then, did the Tom Swift terminal ever get manufactured?
No, not as such. But you could argue that, nothing ever got manufactured to that specification. It was a useful thought tool. And it put me well ahead of most other people in terms of understanding what you had to do to create a video display on a computer, using TV, for instance.
And did it lead directly to the Sol?
Yes, it led pretty much directly to the Sol, because Bob Marsh, as I've mentioned, there's another Bob Marsh who was in Silicon Valley, and that's not the same person, but this is the co-founder of Processor Technology, was part of the discussion group that generated the Tom Swift terminal spec. He convinced me to share the rent of a workshop, a garage on 4th Street, 2465 4th Street in Berkeley. And he founded Processor Technology. He was the one who came to me with the legendary January '75 Popular Electronics, saying, this thing is going to need a lot of plugins, and look, this picture is a phony, clearly. So I wound up designing the video display module, VDM1, and then later, I can't remember if it was for the VDM1 or for the Sol, Bob said, we will pay you to design the Tom Swift terminal. I think it was for the Sol, and that was sometime in middle '75.
Yeah. And
the trouble is, it had to be Tom Swift terminal their way.
Was there ever this point at which, when you're talking about like the magazine or whatever, when you're playing, where it's like, hey Madge, bing, it was a light bulb going off kind of thing, like look what the possibilities are here of a web kind of thing?
Well, not for me, but I'm sure that was for other people. I came to the whole issue from the standpoint of the need for tools to develop, or to allow people to develop communities and maintain communities. And it was a long-term kind of thing. Perhaps the closest I came to an epiphany was the incident with the Service Bureau and the network. There, within a very short time, one day, I understood what could be done there. I probably couldn't articulate it particularly well. But there was that. The rest of it was just a lot of work, really. And there may have been one or two other points where there's some minor technical points that appeared.
I'll come back to decentralization, but I wanted to ask you about what it was like in the garage.
Well, to begin with, it was just a garage, it was sized for a big truck could fit in there, maybe. There's 1,200 square feet, had a little loft office in the back, up a ladder, really. And in fact, I had a car that I was keeping in there. So I had a workbench on one side of the room, and Bob occupied the loft office. He was trying to figure out how he could capitalize off of his knowledge of where to get center-cut, 8-inch wide pieces of walnut that a fellow named Steve that he knew could get. It was wood that drove him there.
And where did you get components during this period? Where did you go to find cool stuff?
Well, you could, cool stuff. There's components. I had learned as a junior engineer enough about ordering components from distributors so that you could order COD, UPS from Elmar in Oakland, and if necessary, Mountain View. And there were a few stores around, and there were still some surplus stores around. Certainly there was no computer surplus. Not that made any sense. There were maybe a few modules left over from vacuum tube computers.
Did you actually turn processor technology in that garage into a manufacturing center at one point? Did you
Oh, they were within that garage. They had to move out when they had about 12 people there who were bagging up parts for kits and so forth. They couldn't manufacture anything in that garage, but they did development and kit assembly.
Was the saw always a kit?
Not always, no. Initially it was a kit. But the saw didn't hit the market until they had moved to 6200 Hollis Street in Emeryville. And even then, they were kind of late with it. It was, I don't remember, it was probably the end of 76, early 77. They opened the order books on the saw at the PC 76 computer fair, I guess, in Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Were you there?
I was there.
Were you in the booth?
I was in the booth. I was pitching the product. We were really king of the mountain at that point because everyone else was maybe having a circuit board you could buy. We had sheet metal painted with walnut sides. We had a really big loaded circuit board mounted on a piece of presentation grade mahogany that we would talk around, and it just had everything on it. And I pitched in that booth all morning and into the afternoon when my father, I had invited down from New York, dragged me away to lunch. Time just didn't exist at that point.
It was pretty heady?
It was very heady. It was, and everybody attending was really enthusiastic. They paid $5 to get in. It was in a basement of a crummy hotel that was going to be demolished for casinos soon. No particular air conditioning, high humidity. My father, who had been in the sales promotion end of industrial products like folding tables and chairs, just couldn't get over it. To him, a trade show was someone you had to pay people to attend, and they were just dead places. In this case, it was the most live place that I'd seen.
And were you an employee, a co-founder of Processor? What was your relationship to Marsh?
I was always a contractor.
Yeah.
I was never a principal.
Okay. How did Processor Tech end then?
Well, Processor Tech moved out to Pleasanton in 1978. Now that's a predictable move because that's where the co-founder lived. So somebody has written that at a certain point in the life of organizations, they move their headquarters to be close to the CEO's residence. And that was kind of should have been a sign that something was going on. Processor Tech was always managed by amateurs. They hired some people who may have known what they were doing, but the people on top were always the founders who were amateurs.
And during this time that you were working as a contractor at Processor Tech, were you making the schlep for all the homebrew meetings?
Oh, yes. The first homebrew meeting was March, now I keep forgetting the date, it was sometime around the 15th, 1975. And I drove Bob Marsh down there in my borrowed pickup truck. And that's where he met his market, in effect.
And at what point did you become sort of the master of ceremonies? When I was there, when I visited, you were always the ones that I went to, you were the sort of ringleader. Were you always the ringleader?
I think that started from the fourth meeting. That started in Gordon French's garage in Menlo Park. And he ran the meetings. He and Fred Moore had started it. Fred Moore had hung out at People's Computer Center. They really didn't like him that much, but they put up with him because they had to. It was an open place. And he began taking people's names and creating a card file of people who were interested, like him, in learning about computers. Learning about hardware is what he wanted to learn about. So that when the Altair was announced and when the first Altair hit town, which was March of '75, a review copy was sent to People's Computer Company. In fact, I took it and I gave it to Ephraim, who didn't really know what to do with this thing. It wouldn't do anything. It just had switches and lights. He used it as a decoration, as I recall, for a week. So the meeting was called around that Altair computer, and Fred Moore went to his list. He was a political organizer himself, a sort of peace organizer, and put out a leaflet and put out the word. And I got the word, I can't recall, I think it was through Bob Marsh, I'm not sure. And 30 people showed up. It was very classic grassroots organizing. So Fred would kind of try to be the recording secretary, and Gordon would run the meeting. Gordon wanted to lecture on computer science because he knew something about it. He was a consultant in the field. At the third meeting in the Peninsula School, that's where I noticed that about half the audience was outside of the room where Gordon was lecturing, meeting each other. And I realized lateral communication, community formation, this has to be encouraged. How can we get this inside the room? Well, it happened that Gordon got a contract to work for the Social Security Administration for some period of time and had to go to Baltimore. And I think it was Marty Spurgell, the self-described junk dealer, a fellow who really knew how to buy and sell small things, who put my name up as for running the meeting, and nobody thought it was a bad idea, and I wouldn't say no. So I began running the meeting from the fourth meeting, and generally ran every meeting except those I couldn't be at.
Now, do you know the events surrounding the liberation of Bill's Altair Basic? Sokol tells a story. Can you confirm or?
I can't confirm from first-hand standpoint. I have heard things, but I cannot give any first-hand confirmation. I do know that shortly after Microsoft came through town with their BASIC, there were paper tape copies of BASIC that we encouraged people to copy and circulate. The way we saw it, this was part of the machine. It was how the machine is made to work. We already knew that with switches and lights it wouldn't do anything, and I certainly didn't have the peripherals, but others were working on doing that. And we felt that it was pretty outrageous that they were charging as much as the machine cost for what it required to make the machine work.
And what did you think when you got the letter from Bill? Do you remember the
When the letter came in from Bill accusing us all of being thieves, of stealing his BASIC, I thought it was way out of line, and I think everybody else did. We had a good laugh about that in the meeting. Now, nobody gave up and gave a discourse on copyright law or what if the tables were turned. Well, the important thing is our whole focus was on spreading the technology, spreading the use of it. And in fact, it was just the right thing to do from a marketing perspective for Bill, but he didn't know that at the time. He had labored hard to create this one thing and was amazed to find that everybody wouldn't cheerfully pay him $500 for it. Remember, everybody had bitten on the promise of a mini computer for what, $327, under $500, and everybody had found out that it took a great deal more in terms of money, time, and anguish to get it working, at least up to the point where it could take software. So they were ill-disposed to think, oh joy, I can spend $500 more and have the BASIC, and then I can start using my computer. So we were not sympathetic, and there were some arguments raised about, you know, is it illegal to give someone a newspaper, for instance, from a copyright perspective? But we really didn't have any lawyers there, weren't that interested in the law. We were interested in making things happen.
Now, has anybody ever done a sort of tried to quantify how many companies came out of the nucleus of homebrew?
A count was made at one point. The answer is 23. It included Apple. And the only surviving company at this date is, I believe, what was called the Computer Doctors. Whether or not it's running under a different name, I don't know, but I believe it is still surviving.
Well, this is a little shop over on...
A little local computer repair shop.
Yeah, on El Camino.
Yeah.
We should go see it.
I've never visited it.
Yeah.
But the rest of them rose and fell.
With the
Now,
exception
Apple
of that.
hasn't fallen. Apple is still around, so I guess I should modify that statement. Certainly, it's not recognizable.
Now, aside from Processor Tech, were you involved in any of the other companies that came directly out of Homebrew?
Well, only to the extent that Adam Osborne would go there to sell his books, and he created a computer company in 1980, and I was a co-founder of that one. Hold on. All right.
And between Processor Technology and Osborne, what did you do?
Well, I had made a deal whereby I got royalties on my designs. I strongly recommend this. You don't have to give the royalties back when the company goes under. And so I, for once, had a good amount of money. So I incorporated and set up a shop in 1978, Golemics Incorporated. I guess it was incorporated in 79. And I was trying to develop next things for Processor Technology. I would drive down to Pleasanton, 40 minutes each way, and talk with them about the kinds of things they might want. And they would talk about this and talk about that. And they brought in Bill Etra, who was a video artist, and he would talk about video and show some things. I never got a clear statement from them about what they wanted. Finally, far too late, I asked them, look, what do you guys want? And they said, we don't know. We're just seeing what you could come up with. Back to the police radio kind of thing. Apparently it was my responsibility to go out in advance. It would have been nice if they'd told me.
Where did the name Tom Swift Terminal come from?
Well, I can't recall. I think I had read one Tom Swift book, but it might have been a kind of off-brand that didn't use the actual name Tom Swift, but it was all the characters, the young inventor and his pals and so forth, inventing their way through life and problems and adventures. The name I came up with because the computer club that was supposed to grow around this piece of equipment was to have been populated by would-be Tom Swifts. I think that impetus is there in most people, who knows, but certainly is there in me, but then I'm an atypical. Yeah, I would call it the Tom Swift tendency. Now, the Tom Swift books, by the way, are thoroughly unrealistic and about as 12-year-old or 14-year-old boy genius sort of thing who never seems to have any adults supervising him. But people responded to it, and kids grew up imagining themselves doing that. And it stems, I think, from a particularly American tendency to think that the ordinary person, if they turned their minds to it, could understand the technology and work with it just as much as the specialists, the people who we can call members of the priesthood. And that, in fact, was kind of a necessity in American history, because a lot of technology, farm implements, automobiles, trucks, and so forth, went out into this huge country where there really were not any formal means of educating people on how to deal with it, how to maintain it, repair it. And so the farm boys who had been keeping the farm implements going put their minds to it and learned enough about automobile mechanics, for instance, so that the shade tree mechanic became the real American symbol, or icon. And it's not considered unusual. It's sort of, well, it's slightly honorable, but this guy, he's a good shade tree mechanic. It's a good thing to say about somebody. Doesn't raise them above you, but it does shine a nice little light on them. So that, it doesn't stop with cars, is the point. And as Ivan Illich pointed out, it's not really indigenous to the U.S. It shows up elsewhere. Perhaps some cultures discourage it. You're dirtying your hands by messing around with the equipment. Certain European cultures would say that. So you're lowering yourself if you get involved in the equipment. And nobody's going to praise you for it.
I wanted to jump around a little bit. How did you come to become or how did you become the military editor of the Berkeley Barb?
Well, I went into the Barb again trying to find a tool for community, and then I was trying to use the press. So I was pretty good at summarizing press releases, boiling them down to one paragraph, one line. The Barb was run by Max Scher, but it was run in his house, and it was really a very homespun operation. And there you could get a byline when you felt that you were entitled to it. You'd put it on the story when you felt that you were up to it. Didn't always get out, but that's how you did it. So after a year or so, I showed up there in 1966. But after a year, I began to write some stories with my byline. Now, I always saw myself as an engineer. I always saw myself as somebody who was trying to take technical understanding, knowledge, and apply it to this task of creating a tool for community building. And what I also was seeing around me were a lot of people who are doing kinds of theater, in effect, and calling it politics. In fact, I read a book not too long ago by a fellow named David Merowitz, who was there then, called I think it's the Radical Soap Opera, in which he analyzed it all as theater. So I would see people doing things that were pretty impractical and making statements they couldn't support, and sometimes I felt I should jump in and advise them on this. I studied up on various things that were going around then. People were, learning about explosives. They weren't always setting explosives off, but there was talk about it. Well, if you're going to talk about it, you better know how to do something, or you better know why not to do it. So I began writing little articles, saying, for instance, that some article that had been written over here suggesting that radio transmitters could be powered off of car batteries wasn't really going to work. Don't waste your time on that. And I remember I did one military editor. Well, by that time I was calling myself the military editor. But where it came from was, in 1967, the Barb got a press release from the press room of an aircraft carrier, the USS Valley Forge. And that was handed to me to rewrite. I looked at it and I asked, why are they sending us this? And the press release was about something called a landing ship dock. It was some sort of landing craft. And the number of the ship was Landing Ship Dock 26. And I said, hey, LSD 26. Of course, LSD was LSD 25 in the chemical notation. So I thought, I could make something out of this. And so I wrote a humorous article that said that we have discovered that the Navy is introducing LSD 26 into the Bay Area. The press release is about the arrival of this boat. And it was clearly a humorous article. And I bylined it, military editor, Lee Felsenstein, Barb, military editor. The next week we got a subscription from the press room of the Valley Forge and a letter that said, this is the first time any of our press releases have been printed by other than a military paper. Well, that was nice, and so that allowed me to use the name, which I did when I tried to make technical commentary on some of the things that were being talked about in the name of politics and revolution or whatever. You get a lot of silliness going around, and I tried to kind of tamp down some of the silliness.